Hi, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Today, we're going to answer all of your questions on free trade, fair trade, protectionism, and of course, how all this affects lumber prices, right? Before we do that, I just want to make you aware of something. If listening to me ramble on for 45 minutes to an hour is just too much, but you would like to get some of these ideas in short, 3-minute snippets, and I want you to go check out the Y Minutes. Y Minutes is another program where we take an interesting topic, such like the one we're doing today, but we illustrate the points in about a 3-minute story where we explain underlying principle and hopefully show you something in a perspective that you've never considered before. So the Y Minutes, check that out. All right, let's go into free trade. So this is an area where for, most of the last 100 years, most economists were kind of on the same sheet of music with respect to free trade, at least in the United States. Not everybody, obviously, but there was a general consensus. And typically, on the right, you have a lot of respect for free markets, but there's also kind of this protectionist angle that comes out with respect to protecting your industry against whatever it might be, protecting your country, protecting your economy against cheap imports, or maybe other countries are putting tariffs on your producers, but we're not putting them on theirs, and is that fair? And the big question here is falls along a couple of lines. One is, economically, what makes the most sense, right? Between all these different ideas of trade, what makes sense when we talk about international trade from an economic perspective? Right. Another perspective has to do with things like patriotism, right? Should we have a special fealty for products or services that are produced here in the United States? And then there's also a moral component, right? So we're going to be talking about all three, the economic side, the patriotic side, the moral side, as we discuss the different views and approaches to trade. So first and foremost, what is free trade? Free trade is essentially the ability to engage in exchange with somebody else, and generally, again, when trade obviously takes place domestically as well. Every time you make a transaction, that's a trade. But a lot of times when we talk about trade policy, we're talking about international trade. So free trade would be there's no tariffs, taxes, or restrictions on your goods and services when you sell it in our country, and you don't put any tariffs, taxes, or restrictions on our products when we sell it in your country, right? That's free trade. Right now, a lot of people talk about fair trade, and that's the idea, and the concept behind it is generally associated with the fact that free trade usually doesn't happen with respect to most products, right? There's always some sort of economic carve out or set asides, or maybe we sell a bunch of stuff over there, but a foreign country sells a bunch of stuff in the United States, but then they put up protectionist barriers which prevents us from selling our products in their country, and so fair trade is kind of this concept. I would almost call it like an ideal where the rules apply across the board. So if you have a tariff, then we have a tariff. If you have a restriction, then we have a restriction, right? And it kind of mirrors the policy of each individual country. So that's what fair trade, as I understand it, is trying to achieve. And there's what we call protectionist policy. And protectionist policy is essentially when the government comes in and says, we're going to actively restrict trade, and ostensibly it's for the benefit of domestic industry. Okay, so you might see this in the form of a sugar tariff, right? We have sugar tariffs in the United States, which says that if you're going to produce sugar overseas and then sell it in the United States, we tax it at a higher level in order to protect the American sugar industry, right? And you see this all over the world, countries engage in it. That philosophy is built around this idea that if you can somehow give your people, your industry, a competitive advantage with respect to trade through government policy. And again, usually this comes in the form of either tariffs or taxes on foreign products, or it comes in the form of government subsidies to domestic industries. So, for instance, a tariff is if an American wants to buy a product made in, we'll say, Singapore. The government comes in and says, okay, Singapore company, you can sell that product in America, but we're going to charge you a 20% tariff, and that elevates the price. So what ends up happening is it's not the Singapore country necessarily that pays that, it's the American consumer. So now when I go to the store, I could have bought that product for 20% cheaper, but now I buy it 20% more expensive than it otherwise would have been. And again, generally that's because maybe there's an American industry producing the same product, but they don't produce it as cheaply as the Singapore company. And so we raise the tax on the Singapore product to bring it in line with the American product, or even maybe make it more expensive than the American product. right? So that's a tariff way to engage in protectionism. Another way to gain in that kind of protectionism is to subsidize a domestic company. So you say, okay, the taxpayers we're going to put so much tax dollars into a particular industry, right? Maybe it's solar panels. We're going to put a bunch of tax dollars into that industry, and that's going to make it more competitive, either domestically or in a world market, right? So that's another way the government can engage in trying to give favor to a domestic industry over a foreign industry. All right, so a lot of people look at that and they think, well, that seems to make sense, right? If we're allowing a foreign country to sell all their products over the United States without any restrictions or any additional taxes or anything like that, and then our companies go over to that country and try to sell products, and then they raise all kinds of tariffs, well, that's not fair. And so we should raise the taxes on their products as like almost a form of punishment or a way to support our domestic industry. The question is does it work, right? Because on a moral level, that seems to make sense. You don't want to do business with me, fine, we're not going to do business with you. And here's what I'd say on the moral side.